The Montenegrins, who are continually in danger of invasion from the Turks, feel no interest in any object save that of self-defense against their cruel neighbors. Art, science, literature, all that constitute European glory is a dead blank to them. His gun, his poniard, and his Bible, which, by the by, he kisses oftener than he reads, are all that are necessary for the happiness of a Montenegrin. It is probable that I shall not escape the lash of critical censure, since it has been my task to describe what is new, unknown, and singular. That, however, will give me but little concern. Criticism, when its object is to correct errors, can never give offense, and that which is written from the dictates of envy or spleen deserves only contempt. In the former case, he who is wise will silently correct his faults, but, in the latter, the critic deserves no notice. When the French advanced to the gates of Castel, Nuovo, and Illyria, and from thence to the mouths of the Catero, the people of Montenegro began to be frequently mentioned throughout Europe, though, perhaps, in a manner no less vague than in the few scanty notices which had previously appeared respecting them. The Montenegrins are that warlike people who, towards the end of 1806, descended in a mass from their mountains, at the summons of the revered Vladika, or prince, bishop of the country, whom the Emperor of Russia had attached to his cause. When the French force approached Castel Nuovo, it was unexpectedly attacked by 10,000 Montenegrins united to the Russian troops, who had landed on the banks of the Saturina. Our army was thus thrown into disorder, and was obliged to retreat by Ragusa, which the Montenegrins entered in the confusion of the pursuit. They immediately took possession of the town, levied contributions, laid waste old Ragusa, and burnt Santa Croce, better known by the name of Gravosa or the port of Ragusa. In a second engagement they were, however, completely defeated and dispersed, being unable to sustain the regular attack of our battalions. The Russians, who had placed great reliance on the Montenegrins, were, in consequence, obliged to re-embark precipitately, renouncing, on the one hand, the advantages of an excellent position, and, on the other, the aid of a numerous squadron, which, while it intercepted the entrance to the mouths of the Catero, would have dealt destruction along the plain of the Salterns, which we occupied. 48 hours sufficed for the retreat of the enemy's force. The Vladika, who, 2 days before, had been animating the courage of his hordes and leading them on with extraordinary courage and skill, now hastily retired to the convent of Savina, which was covered by the line of Castel, Nuovo, and the Spanish fort. There he rallied his forces, and, on the third day, commenced his march towards Montenegro. The Montenegrin troops, being chiefly trained to act as sharpshooters and to fire from behind rocks, were consequently very ineffective in the engagements of the Salians, which is a plain of tolerable extent. Our troops had but little intercourse with the natives, and even our generals and principal officers seem to have regarded it as a matter of no great importance to make observations on their character. Having been entrusted with the government of one of the provinces of Montenegro for the space of 6 years, I enjoyed ample time and opportunity for forming a correct notion of the manners, customs, and character of the natives. I penetrated into the heart of their mountains, visited their villages and habitations, attended their ceremonies and festivities. Thus have I been enabled to observe attentively their way of life, and to mark the various characteristics which distinguish them. The Montenegrins inhabit that chain of high mountains extending from the valley of Garba along Herzegovina, as far as the confines of the district of Castel Nuovo, from north to south, and over the whole of the province of Catero, from east to west. Montenegro derives its name both from its situation and its aspect. Those enormous mountains, which were formerly overgrown with fir trees, appeared black on all sides and from every point. This circumstance determined their denomination among a people guided by nature alone, and the country was called, in the Illyrian language, Chernigor or Chernigora, Black Mountain. It is situated between 18 and 19 deg of longitude, east from Greenwich, and the 42 and 43 deg of latitude. It is bounded on the east by the Catalic of Antivari, and Upper Zenta on the south by the mouths of the Catero, from Pastravicio to the province of Herzegovina on the west, by Herzegovina on the north, by Herzegovina as far as the Bosnian Vizerate, and by the mountains of Albania proper. It is consequently surrounded on 3 sides by the Turkish territory, and on the 4th by what was formerly Venetian Albania. The country is divided into 5 parts, called Nahiya, or departments, namely Katanska, Riska, Pisavaska, Lisoska, and Cherniska. Each of these departments forms various counties, and these counties are again divided into communities. The principal rivers of Montenegro are, first, the Rikov Zrnovic, which has its source in the ravines between Lovhin and Kaloksum, and flows into the lake of Skutari. This river abounds in fish. 2d. The Skimza, which is formed of several streams rising in the ravines of the upper mountains and uniting together at Bychisi, it falls into the Moraca 1 mile above the mouth of the Limi. 3d. The Zeta or Poria, which takes its source among the Pisori Mountains and flows into the Moraca opposite to the town of Podgorica. And 4th, the Sesiza, which rises to the north of Mount Paisiori and falls into the Moraca below Budina. The situation of Montenegro, which is everywhere intersected with mountains and valleys, resembles that of the Alps of Switzerland. The scenery is, however, in a more rude style, and, at first sight, the multitude of rocks gives the country an appearance of sterility, which does not in reality belong to it. The climate is milder than Switzerland and may, generally speaking, be compared to Macedonia. Montenegro is the only country in Europe which does not contain a town, or even any cluster of habitations, large enough to be compared to one. The country, including Upper Zenta, measures in circuity about 100 miles, of 60 to a degree, containing a surface of 418 such square miles. In the time of the Lower Empire, under the dominion of the Greek emperors, Montenegro was included in the province called Nabia Prevalchania, which extended from the mouths of the Cataro to the river Drino. It consequently embraced a portion of Dalmatia, Albania, and that part of Macedonia known by the name of Salutaris. Before it became subject to the Romans, Montenegro had been governed by the kings of Illyricum, who resided at Skadra, now Scutari, which was the capital until the defeat of Gentius. Montenegro afterwards became a federal government, or more properly formed a federal republic, until, under Augustus, it was once more united to the Roman Empire. The country, after being at various periods a prey to the incursions of the Goths, finally became subject to the Sclavonians. After the fall of the Sclavonian kings, Montenegro again became a part of the Greek Empire and was afterwards subjected to the kings of Servia, but, on the destruction of that kingdom, it fell under the dominion of various princes, who, from being simple governors, acquired such power as enabled them to dispute for the territories of their sovereigns. This order of things continued until the close of the 14th century, when George, king of the two Zentas, sought refuge in Russia against the attacks of the Venetians. He surrendered the two Zentas as well as Montenegro, and the latter became a prey to the enterprises of petty princes. At length, with the assistance of the inhabitants, George succeeded in conquering a part of the Zentas in Montenegro. But he did not long enjoy his success, for he was obliged to flee, to avoid falling into the power of the despotic prince who then ruled Montenegro. Finally, after various political changes and civil wars, the descendants of this last named prince lost the sovereignty and were conquered and driven away by the Turks about the end of the 15th century. From that period, the Ottomans extended their dominion over the whole country. They, however, maintained but a feeble sway over the Montenegrins, who were in a constant state of insurrection. During the reign of Peter the Great, Russia had shewn a disposition to subdue Montenegro to her influence, doubtless with the view of effecting useful diversions in her wars with the Turks. The Tsar attained his object, and the Montenegrins, instigated by skillful emissaries, openly took up arms against the Turks in the year 1692. They declared themselves independent and maintained their supremacy until the year 1718, when they offered to surrender to the Venetians in order to rid themselves of the Ottoman yoke. But this plan was not carried into execution, on account of the Peace of Passarevitch, which was concluded the same year and which annulled the reciprocal arrangements of the two nations. At length the Montenegrins, irritated by some outrages committed against them, attacked the Turks and took up Zenta in the year 1761. This action was succeeded by a truce of short duration. New cruelties, on the part of the Turks, again excited a storm, and the Montenegrins wreaked their just vengeance on the Porte in the war which ensued between the Empress Catherine and the Turks in 1768. The Montenegrins experienced some reverses, but, though they may have seemed occasionally to bow to the Ottoman power, their homage has been a matter of form, rather than real dependence. In the year 1770, they succeeded in freeing themselves from the Turkish yoke, but in the following year, Mehmet, Pasha of Scutari, penetrated into Montenegro and committed the most dreadful ravages. The Vladica, who was attached to Russia and relied on her support, took up arms against the Turks in 1788. In the following year, he united his force to 400 imperial troops, under the command of Major Vinkosovic, attacked Albania and ravaged the states of the new Pasha of Scutari, who was meditating an incursion on Montenegro, whence he had carried off women, money, and cattle in revenge for the union of the Montenegrins with the enemies of the Porte. Having thus openly manifested themselves alternately for the interests of Russia and Austria, it appeared both natural and just that the Montenegrins should rely on the protection of one or other of these powers. But, on the contrary, the Peace of Sisto, which was concluded in 1791, acknowledged them to be the subjects of the Porte and delivered them over to the barbarity of their enemies. The people, indignant at this policy, swore to pay no tribute, and men, women, and children took up arms to resist the orders of the Pasha. The Turks, irritated by this persevering opposition, combined their forces and marched once more to reduce the Montenegrins to obedience. But, on this occasion, the powerful voice of liberty was heard, and its echoes resounded even to the cell of the Vladica, who joyfully joined the people in this struggle for their independence. In 1795, he united his force to the subjects of the Pasha of Scutari, attacked the Pasha, and wrested from the hands of his mortal enemies the remainder of the district of Upper Zenta. He fought in person, with heroic valor, against Mahmud Busaklia, a Pasha, who commanded a corps of 12,000 men. In the first action the Pasha was repulsed with considerable loss, and, at last, having imprudently charged the Montenegrins among the passes of Sedigna, he was taken prisoner and beheaded, and his head is still to be seen in the Vladica's chamber in the convent of Sedigna. After the defeat of Mahmud Busaklia, the government of Montenegro approached to democracy, though, at the same time, the Vladica acquired such an ascendancy over the people that he was named over king. The Montenegrins have since invariably contended with the neighboring Turkish commanders, whenever the least encroachment has been made on their liberties or the boundaries of their territory. Thus, they have never in reality been tributary either to the Turks or the Venetians. A few detached frontier villages have, it is true, been momentarily subjected by the Turks since the year 1804, but though the Montenegrins are under the special protection of Russia, they boast of enjoying absolute independence, admission to the territory of the Montenegrins, their mode of receiving strangers, difficulty of obtaining an asylum, security when once obtained. We have now arrived at that period of the history of the Montenegrins when I entered among them. I left Cattaro on the 10th of November, 1810, having previously written to the governor to announce my arrival, a measure which was indispensable, both for my own safety, and to remove all apprehension on the part of the Montenegrins. As I approached the frontier, a detachment of 24 armed men saluted me with a discharge of musketry. The chief of the detachment came to meet me, leading a child who carried 2 flasks of wine, one white and the other red. "We will drink that which you prefer," said he. I chose the white. I observed, indeed, that they drank a great deal of white wine, of which they had an abundant supply. The detachment of honor formed itself into 2 divisions. The commandant ranged himself next me, and we marched on to Verba. We advanced slowly, being frequently impeded by the state of the soil, and, besides, every object around me excited my astonishment and attention. I was soon convinced that Montenegro is not, as some writers have alleged, a country surrounded by mountains, but, on the contrary, it is itself a mountainous country interspersed with what are called plateaus, or level heights. It rises above all the adjacent territories, and one mountain towering above all the rest is called Monte Sella or Monte Silo. The common people give it the former name, because, when viewed from Castel Nuovo or the point of Ostro, it presents the appearance of a saddle. The better informed class of people, however, call it Monte Silo, as, from its extraordinary height, it appears to tower to the very heavens. Montenegro is on every side extremely difficult and dangerous of access. The only regular road is by the way of Cherniska. On every other point it presents a confused mass of rocks, intersected with frightful chasms, which seem to penetrate into the interior of the earth. The most frequented road from Cattaro to Montenegro is by the village of Scagliari, leaving Mount Vermaz and Trinity Fort on the right, or through the hamlets of Spigliari. The latter road leads to Verba, the first Montenegrine village, and is the shortest though the most difficult course. To form an idea of Montenegro, the reader must picture to himself 3 immense ranges of mountains, rising almost perpendicularly from the bosom of the ocean and exhibiting no traces of habitation. In ascending these mountains, the most skillful climber is at every little distance in danger of losing his balance, should he neglect the precaution of keeping his body constantly inclined towards the mountain. In other parts, the soil is covered with fragments heaped together, which give way on the slightest pressure, and render the progress of the traveler equally perilous and slow, until after incredible fatigue he reaches the first level height. Here a rude country extends on every side, covered with fragments of rock, which have either fallen or been washed down by wild cataracts. From this spot the Adriatic is discernible in its whole extent beyond Mount Vermaz, and the mountain itself, though of considerable height, scarcely seems to rise above the surface of the sea. By the aid of our guides we penetrated into the country by narrow paths, between the mountains so close together, and so similar in the strata of various substances of which they were composed, that there is every probability they have been separated by earthquakes. In about an hour we emerged from these intricacies, and reached the level height of the second range of mountains, whence the first range seemed to be blended with the boundless plain beneath our feet. In proportion as we advanced, the picture assumed a darker hue, and the inaccessible rocks, blackened by time, were totally devoid of verdure. We penetrated the next chain of mountains by paths even more rugged than the former, and at length arrived on the level height at the foot of Mount Silo, where cold prevails at every season of the year. On the left, towards the mountains which border Herzegovina, a considerable extent of heath affords pasture to numerous herds of cattle. On the right, Mount Silo rises majestically. Its summit is lost in the clouds, and the eternal snow which covers the barren part of the mountain is bounded at the point where vegetation commences by rows of fir trees. As we approached the tremendous Mount Silo, the roaring of wild beasts, the cries of carnivorous birds, the incessant dashing of the water, the inclemency of the atmosphere, and the claps of thunder which succeeded each other without intermission, all tended to impress us with the idea of some revolution in the laws of nature. I could not quit this place without endeavoring to gather some information on the subject of ornithology. According to what I learned from the Montenegrins, it would appear that all the birds of their country are common to the rest of Europe, but still they afford abundant interest to naturalists, as birds of every species inhabit the country. The eagle and the vulture are remarkable for their prodigious size. Birds of passage pair at several periods of the year, but each species is visible only for 10 or 12 days. Among the wild beasts of Montenegro, the bear, the wolf, and the wild boar are most remarkable. They are, however, by no means numerous, for the natives being all hunters or shepherds, it is natural that they should adopt every precaution for preserving their flocks. They are continually armed and continually wandering, and thus are ever on the alert to destroy mischievous animals. From Mount Silo we directed our course towards the interior, and after 4 hours of horrible solitude, we arrived at Verba, the first village in the direction of Catero. Verba is rudely built on a rocky soil. Here, however, the country begins to be somewhat cultivated, for hitherto we had observed only a few wild pear trees growing here and there. Verba is one of the villages which supply the markets of Catero. On our way to Brach we found the ground covered with gravel. This might be supposed to render the soil barren, but, on the contrary, experience proves it to be favorable to cultivation. We occasionally observed detached huts rudely constructed of boughs and earth, and roofed with the bark of trees. They consist of only one apartment, with a fire in the center, and men and beasts all live under one roof. The villages of Zalassi, Mali, Zalassi, Veliki, and Zagliwit, on account of their positions, are more important than is generally supposed. They overlook the whole province, and on any important event they become the rendezvous of the Montenegrins, where the orators of the country display their talent and lay plans for enterprises. Brach presents nothing remarkable except the quantities of potatoes which the soil produces spontaneously. They are principally used for feeding hogs, but those of the natives who have traveled eat them, and indeed they are now beginning to be generally liked. On arriving before Brach, we found a post of Montenegrins, who had received orders to join us, after saluting us with military honors, by the usual discharge of musketry. With our party thus augmented, we arrived at Negassi, where the governor resides. The governor came to meet me, accompanied by the proto-papa, 2 papas or priests with their families, and about 60 armed men of the first rank. After the customary compliments, the governor took my left hand and raised it to his right shoulder, and placed his right hand on my left shoulder. "You have come," said he, "to render me happy by giving me a friend. I love you already, and the stars must disappear from the firmament ere you can be obliterated from my memory." He then conducted me to his house, where a repast was prepared for a numerous party. We marched along amidst the firing of guns, the ringing of bells, and the acclamations of the people, who, from the remotest corners of the village, thronged to the governor's house. All pressed forward to gain a sight of me. The women and children in particular seemed lost in wonder, and continually exclaimed, "Bog! Soldata ad Napoleona! God, a soldier of Napoleon!" I was treated with extreme politeness by the governor and his numerous famiglia, and the primates vied with each other for the honor of sitting near me at table, or accompanying me in my visits to the protopapa and the Nez, who is the chief of their temporal primates. Negosi, the constant residence of the governor, has a pretty appearance from a distance. It is built on a vast circular plain. In the center of the mountains, numerous large habitations surround it at the foot of the hills and rising in an amphitheater produce a very agreeable effect. This effect, however, vanishes on a nearer approach. The houses, which, when viewed from a distance appear to form one continued line, are detached one from another, and for the most part surrounded with gardens. Negosi is, however, one of the most considerable villages in the country and is the seat of the temporal authority. The Montenegrins observe no regular plan in the construction of their houses. Everyone is his own architect, and for any building of importance they have recourse to foreign masons. The convents and churches, together with the houses of the governor and a few other persons of rank, are well built and present a singular contrast to the rest of the village. Except in the temples of the Montenegrins, no traces of sculpture or ornament of any kind is observable, either in the interior or exterior of their buildings. The few articles of furniture that are here and there to be met with are of a very rude form, and those which combine utility with anything like neatness are brought from Apulia, Trieste, or Venice. With regard to the interior of the houses, one description will suffice for all. The inhabitants sleep on mats or carpets spread out upon the ground. The fire is kindled in the middle of the room, and large stones or wooden stools are placed round it. The use of furniture is indeed scarcely known among the Montenegrins. A few rude shelves, hung on the walls, serve to deposit their milk, cheese, and the supply of meat necessary for their daily food. Their clothes are hung on pegs in one corner of the room, and a few boxes serve to contain any articles which they consider of value. These boxes are portable, and are used by all the people of Montenegro, where continual warfare has ever rendered permanent establishment and the security of property impracticable. Imbued with that species of vanity common to all warlike people, their highest gratification is to possess a large assortment of arms. This is the national luxury of the Montenegrins. The present governor is named Bogdano Radinish. He is descended from a very ancient family, which has for a long time inherited the dignity of governor from father to son. This family, indeed, deserves this honor for the bravery and patriotism which have always distinguished it. Bogdano is 40 years of age. Though not tall, he is very well made and joins a pleasing expression to regular features. His conversation is easy and sensible. The costume of the governor, on occasions of ceremony, consists of a close jacket of sky blue satin strewed with beads of massy gold, which, from the way in which they are arranged, give it the appearance of a coat of mail. Over this he wears a short mantle of deep red satin, cut in the Spanish style. In winter both the mantle and jacket are made of cloth of the same color. He wears a round hat, which upon solemn occasions is ornamented with white or black feathers, and a girdle of crimson satin embroidered with gold. His pantaloons are short and very wide, after the Turkish fashion, and his stockings are either silk or cotton. He wears by turns boots, buckled shoes, and apankas, but most commonly slippers similar to those worn by the Turks. The governor, as well as the other inhabitants, always walks armed with a gun on his shoulder, a poignard about 2 feet long, and 2 pistols in his girdle. He is invested with the orders of St. George and St. Anne of Russia. I could not avoid expressing my surprise at seeing a chief attired as a Spaniard among a people whose costume is so dissimilar, who have no sort of relation with Spain, and who have besides established, as a principle, that no one can wear any but the national dress. The circumstance was explained to me in the following manner. About 2 centuries ago the ancestors of Bogdano sent a vessel to Spain, commanded by one of their family, who carried out some presents for the governor of the port where he intended to land. He received different articles in return, and among them an exceedingly rich Spanish dress. On the return of the ship the governor, on observing that the people greatly admired this dress, resolved to adopt it, and the custom has continued ever since. I am, however, of opinion that the costume of the governor had a different origin. It is known that the Spaniards were long in possession of the Dalmatian coast from Sabiancello to the Albanian territory, and that they formed establishments on the confines of Morlatia, Herzegovina, and Montenegro in order to secure their conquests against any attack from those quarters. They built, in the territory of Castel Nuovo, a fort of some importance, which still bears the name of the Spanish fort, and as there is no doubt that the Montenegrin people, or at least their chiefs, maintained an intercourse with the Spanish leaders, they may have received presents of dress from them, or adopted the Spanish costume as the model of their own. Originally, the Montenegrin governors wore the gunine, or short cassock, which is the real national dress, without any other distinction than the girdle and surtout, which resembled what we call a spencer. The governor's family is very numerous. He himself has 7 children, who live in the same house with his brothers, sisters, and other relations. His wife regulates his household. It must not be imagined that this Montenegrin chief inhabits a sumptuous palace, that he has guards and a brilliant court. Parade of this kind has not yet become necessary to ensure the respect of the people, whom he rules by the strictest justice. His residence is like one of our rich farmers' houses. I could not avoid evincing some surprise at the simplicity of his habitation. He perceived it, and one day said to me with much kindness, "I would wish to receive you in a way more worthy of your merits. You overwhelm me with benefits. My house, it is true, does not in any respect resemble that of a chief, but no matter, my happiness depends on its being as it is." I replied, that the inhabitants of a palace were not the most happy, and that his attentions pleased me much more than the constrained politeness I might receive under the most splendid roof. The governor, as well as the Vladika, lives on his private revenues. I was told that he received an annual pension of 6,000 ducats from Russia, but in conversing one day on the subject he seemed to deny it. Comer to obtain some knowledge of the forms of the Montenegrin government, I could not of course do better than consult a man who was one of its principal members. I therefore applied to the governor, who furnished me with minute information on the subject. Originally the Montenegrin chiefs were chosen by the people. Each village elected a voivode or captain of the community. Each nahia or province, department or district made choice of 2 chiefs, called sardars, and the supreme chief of the nation was chosen by the sardars and received the title of governor. Sometimes the whole body of the people elected the governor, and they have also occasionally deposed and even beheaded him. This form of government, however, no longer exists. The present government consists of, first, the Vladika or prince, bishop, second, the governor, and third, 5 sardars or chiefs of nahia to operate as a check on the 2 first and preserve an equilibrium of power. The governor and the 5 sardars are elected by the nez, who, in their turn, are chosen by the voivodes, and the latter are appointed by the communitics. Peter Petrovich, the present Vladika, since his AC session, has arrogated to himself all the power of the state, and has left merely the shadow of authority in the hands of the governor and the sardars. The people boast of being the freest in the world, though Tieni Vladika and other chiefs hold them in great subjection, and violent insurrections occasionally arise. Some years since, with the consent of Russia, a tribunal called the Kluduk was established for the administration of justice. No funds, however, have lately been forwarded from Russia for the support of this establishment, and the governor expressed to me his great regret for the suspension of the only resources which might enable him to establish among his people the institutions of Europe. Montenegro affords a convincing proof that laws and customs have their real origin in the wants and distinct character of each nation, in local circumstances or historical events. The governor of Montenegro, though he acknowledged and lamented the defects of the institutions of his country, still maintained that they were better than those of other nations. The reader will not therefore be surprised to hear that Montenegro does not yet possess any political or civil constitution. All the rights and interests of the people are dependent on custom, which have either been preserved by tradition or registered in manuscripts deposited in the archives of the convent of Cetin. In common civil cases, the chiefs of communitics, together with 1 or 2 primates, exercise the functions of judges. The nez, the primates, and the voivodes decide the more important causes, and their sentences are finally ratified by the bishop. In criminal causes, however, and particularly in cases of homicides, the family of the deceased, without awaiting the decision of a superior tribunal, immediately avenges the outrage on the family of the aggressor, destroying his property and murdering his relations. These cases occur but seldom, yet, when they do happen, they give rise to scenes of the most dreadful confusion and bloodshed, which are finally appeased by pecuniary punishments and public censure. Thus it is remarkable that no crime, however great, is punished by death among the Montenegrins, the least civilized people in Europe. When I made some observations on this subject to the governor, said he, with much feeling, it would be worthy of nations more wise and more enlightened to obliterate the punishment of death from their criminal code. They condemn homicide, while, at the same time, they juridically consecrate it. Is it just that the law should deprive a man of what it cannot again restore to him? For the use of annual contributions, determined by interior laws, is absolutely unknown at Montenegro. The assessments depend on the wants of the state. Agriculture, commerce, hunting, and the use of water and the woods are free to everyone. Fishing only is prohibited. It is reserved for the Vladica. On the third day after our arrival at Negosi, the governor gave a public entertainment, which was attended by all classes of the people. This afforded me an excellent opportunity for observation. The Montenegrins are in general tall and well-made, with regular features. They combine a bold, determined, and even haughty expression, which, by imparting an appearance of severity, seems, at first sight, to justify the opinion which has been erroneously entertained of their want of humanity. All wear the mustachio, and the greatest insult that can be offered them is to touch it or speak of it with contempt. The following anecdote will afford a proof of the reverence in which the mustachio is held. On the 6th of August, 1810, 2 Italian soldiers entered a casino or public house, and, one of them taking hold of the mustachio of a mountaineer, who was there, said to him, "Dobro jutro brate," upon which the Montenegrin fired his pistol at him and immediately disappeared. They always shave the fore part of the head, and, in general, allow their beards to grow, or at least shave very seldom. They never cut their nails. The following is the result of the last census, taken in 1812. It includes Upper Zenta. From this estimate it is easy to perceive that Montenegro was formerly much more populous than at present, and that it has declined greatly. The cause must be attributed to their continual dissensions with the Turks, and the great famines and scarcity by which the country has been visited during long wars. In the above estimate, the number of men in arms is stated at 13,105. But this number must be considered relatively, for, in cases of emergency, the army is composed of all the able-bodied men in the country. At Montenegro it is no uncommon thing for men near a century old to devote their last years to the defense of their homes. It may, therefore, without exaggeration, be alleged that in case of an unexpected incursion, every man in the country would, on the first signal, take up arms and march to the point attacked. Founding my calculation on authentic documents, as well as on the results of experience, I can confidently assert that in 12 hours 7,000 or 8,000 men could be assembled on any point, and in 24 hours this number might be increased to 20,000. The Montenegrins are very expert in the use of their arms. They take aim with the greatest accuracy at any distance. Only men naturally incapable of serving are exempt from bearing arms, and it often happens that even invalids forego the dispensation made in their favor and hasten to the defense of their native land. In the last war against Mammoth Busaclia, Pasha of Scutari, Giro Lodicic was confined to his bed by a severe fracture of the leg. During the action which preceded the defeat and death of the Pasha, Giro insisted that he should be carried to a hill from which he could fire on the enemy. No remonstrances could divert him from this resolution. He continued to fire during 3 hours, propped against a hill. When the victory was announced to him, he exclaimed, "It is just in time, for I have no more cartridges, and I should have died of rage had I been compelled to surrender." Chapter V. The National Costume of the Montenegrin Women. The Montenegrins wear dresses of a very thick kind of knitted stuff, resembling serge. The principal part of the dress is usually of a grayish-white color. Other colors are used without distinction, but blue is most common. The dress consists of a gunine or jacket, made in the Grecian style, with wide sleeves and clasped on the breast. One of the corners of this jacket is turned up on the left side and forms a triangle. A waistcoat is worn under the dress and is not seen. The shirt, which is without a collar and not confined within the trousers, hangs down to the knees and forms a sort of short petticoat. Tight pantaloons, or very wide trousers, of the Turkish fashion, are worn indiscriminately. They are tied round the waist by a thong of leather, and, at the bottom, are confined by a net trimming, which also serves to fasten woolen socks of variegated colors. Their shoes are not made in the European manner with leather soles, but consist of a single piece of goat skin made to fit close to the foot. On festival days they wear above the jacket a waistcoat, without sleeves, of green crimson, or black velvet, embroidered with silk. The head is covered in summer as well as winter with a cap of red or violet colored cloth fastened on with a handkerchief like a turban. In addition to the clasp on the breast, the jacket is fastened round the waist by a long woolen scarf of different colors, and also by a large leather strap to which are affixed, on the right side, 2 little cartridge boxes. They also wear pistols in their girdles, and their guns are of the most excellent description. The men usually carry a kind of knapsack on the left shoulder for food, and, on the right, a flask holding about 2 pints. They muffle themselves up in a kind of shawl made of goat's hair, ornamented with long fringe at the ends. This shawl is impenetrable to the rain, but is intended to preserve the arms from the effects of the damp. A Montenegrin never goes abroad unless furnished with all his arms, and he is never to be seen without having in his hand or mouth a pipe with a long tube and ornamented with an amber mouth piece. Nobody can change the national dress by modifying or increasing it in any respect. As soon as a Montenegrin returns from a foreign country, he must immediately throw off its costume and reassume that of his own nation. The women of Montenegro are well made, though of small stature in comparison with the men. They have large and expressive eyes and the finest teeth imaginable. Their skins are somewhat swarthy, as they are almost all accustomed to labor in the open air, but those, on the contrary, who are engaged in domestic duties within doors have complexions of the purest white and red. They all suckle their own children, a practice which contributes in no slight degree to give them that healthful constitution which characterizes the whole population of Montenegro, where women, as well as men, possess extraordinary vigor of body. The women are, in general, not so well dressed as the men. Their costume consists of a long and wide tunic without sleeves, worn over an under dress of still greater length, and with very wide sleeves, embroidered in the ancient Grecian style. The under dress, which serves the purpose of a petticoat, is edged round the bottom with embroidery of colored worsted. A square apron, ornamented all over with worsted embroidery, and edged with fringe, is tied under the tunic, which is open in front. Round their waists is fastened a broad leather girdle, ornamented with various kinds of needle work, and they wear gold or silver rings on their fingers, in their ears, or on their heads, but all coarsely made. They wear the same kind of cap as the men, but without any handkerchief. Long plaits of hair, hanging down on either side, are their only head ornaments. Their shoes are the same as the men's. The head dress of unmarried women consists of a cap of the ordinary form, to which are fastened a great number of coins, which nearly cover the whole of the forehead. These coins are, for the most part, Turkish piasters or common counters in metals. The very young girls wear a cloth cap of different colors, chiefly red or black, with a tuft of black feathers. My departure from Negus was already fixed, but was retarded by the following circumstance. Theodisi, one of the sisters in law of the governor, had been recently delivered. On the governor being informed of the event, he proposed that I should stand godfather to the child, and that it should be named after me. I thanked him for the compliment he paid me, for the Montenegrins consider it the highest mark of honor to ask a person to be godfather to a child, and it is counted a great insult to decline the office. The ceremony took place on the following day, and was performed in the presence of a numerous assemblage. This sacrament may be administered either at church or at home, and, in the present instance, the christening took place at the governor's house. Instead of a man and woman, 2 men stand as sponsors for the child. The ceremony differs but little from ours, and is the same for both sexes, with this difference, that when a girl is christened, a veil is held over her until the priest is ready for the aspersions. The prayers are extremely long. The most remarkable part of the ceremony is the frequency and abundance of the aspersions. The child is half drowned with water and cried furiously the whole time. To the ceremony of baptism is added the burning of incense and the presentation of wine. On a table is placed a vase containing some kind of grain mixed with water and honey, and round it wax tapers are burnt. After the first aspersion, the papa or priest offers a spoonful to every one present. When the child is placed in the cradle, some attributes of its sex are deposited beside it. For instance, if a boy, guns, pistols, and c. The father, having shewn these arms to all the company, kisses them, places them on the lips of his son, and then lays them in the cradle at the right hand of the child. This ceremony is performed with an air of seriousness and gravity which sufficiently attests the importance that is attached to it. The firing of musketry and the ringing of bells continue during the whole time, though the christening should take place in a private house, and the breakfast or dinner, according to the time of day, concludes the ceremony. On the occasion in question the governor gave a grand banquet. The utmost gaiety prevailed, and a great number of healths and toasts were drunk. The following are a few of the good wishes that were expressed in favor of the young infant. They, of course, lose much in being deprived of their rhymes and the laconic spirit of the Illyrian language. May wisdom be his inheritance. May his soul be mild as moon, light. May honey flow in his heart. May he ever be an irreconcilable enemy to the Turks. May he die out of his bed. May he always continue free. The questions which I found it necessary to ask respecting the ceremony of the baptism introduced to my knowledge some curious particulars relative to the customs observed by women in pregnancy and childbirth. During pregnancy, the women of Montenegro observe no particular regimen, nor do they suspend, in any way, their accustomed labors or journeys, for even to the last extremity they are in the habit of carrying heavy burdens. They are generally delivered in the fields or woods without any assistance. When in some degree recovered, they take the child in their aprons and carry it to the nearest stream or fountain, where they wash it, and immediately return to their work. For 3 or 4 months after their birth, the children are wrapped up in old rags. They are then suffered to crawl about as they please, while their mothers labor without doors. Every child is suckled by its mother till she again becomes pregnant, and though that should not be for the space of 5 or 6 years, still the child receives no other nutriment than its mother's milk. When the birth of a child is made known, the relations and friends send cakes to the mother, made of maize and honey, and a feast is given called Babine. Chapter VI. Departure for the Convent of St. Basil. The people all assembled on my departure from Negacy. When I quitted the governor's house, a discharge of musketry was fired, and the proto, Papa and Papa gave me their benediction. When we reached the extremity of the village, my detachment fired a salute, which was answered by the armed men of the place. My design was to traverse Montenegro in every direction, and to observe every place of importance. I should have preferred, in the first instance, to have proceeded to the residence of the Vladika, but, having learned that he was to be absent for some weeks, I determined to visit the convent of St. Basil, for of the miracles performed in it I had heard a great deal. I accordingly directed my course towards the west, by the way of Mount Bukovica. We had arrived within gun-shot of the hamlet of Bukovica, and I presumed we had only to enter it with the freedom which is common throughout Montenegro, when, to my astonishment, my escort suddenly halted and conversed towards her with an air of mystery. At length the chief of the escort advanced about 15 or 20 paces, and exclaimed with a loud voice, "Let the first who hears me take warning that we wish to enter the hamlet." A woman appeared. "What do you want?" said she. "To enter your village." 3 men then made their appearance. "Who are you?" "Montenegrins." "Where do you wish to go?" "To St. Basil, to pay our devotions to the saint." "Make your signals." The chief then made certain signs with his hand. "You may enter." It must be observed that during this dialogue all the armed men of the village hastily assembled, while the dogs, being all collected by a whistle, formed a strong battalion ready to oppose our entrance. The Montenegrin dogs are of a peculiar species, being covered with bristly hair of a dark gray color. In form and ferocity they resemble wolves, and they make a horrible growling at the approach of a stranger. I am an old soldier, yet I must confess that I have often felt more alarm at sight of a host of these dogs than ever I experienced on the approach of the enemy. We entered the village, and the Papa presented himself at the head of the peasantry. "Welcome," said he. "You shall be treated as members of our family." My traveling companion and I, together with the chief of the escort, were lodged in the house of the Papa. He asked us to dine with him, and we readily accepted his invitation. We sat down to table without any cloth, and were not supplied with glasses, spoons, or forks, but, in return, we had abundance of roast meat, fish, and heath cocks, which, for delicacy, may be compared to pheasants. They are eaten with a kind of pudding composed of butter and maize flour. Instead of bread, we were furnished with a sort of cake, which is baked under the ashes. The dessert consisted of cheese, dried figs, and fruits of various kinds. The wine was indifferent, and we all drank one after the other out of the same wooden bowl. The church of the village is more like a decayed barn than a place of worship. It stands in a hollow, surrounded by broken fragments of rock, the interstices of which are filled up by trees and thickets of evergreen. We next directed our course to Skyclick, a commune of some importance, situated in a very fertile part of the country, to the west, at the foot of Mount Bukovica. An immense circular valley unexpectedly lay before us. It was, to all appearance, totally inaccessible, but our guides led us down by means of steps rudely cut in the naked rocks, which are destitute of all traces of vegetation. It was night when we entered the place, but far from experiencing any difficulty, the people seemed to be expecting us. The Papa received us, and assigned lodgings for us all, though we were 30 in number, and found a company of 60 already met. For it was the day of the family festival, and all the members were assembled. We were shivering with cold, and also somewhat wet with the rain that had fallen. Both men and women eagerly came to offer us assistance, and they did it with a feeling of hospitality which might have done honor to the golden age. I never saw any assemblage of people so truly cheerful. The wines of Cherniska flowed liberally, and prepared the guests for an agreeable repast. At length supper was served up. I was placed at a table reserved for the chief of the commune, the Papa and his wife, for, in Montenegro, priests are permitted to marry. The rest of the guests were distributed at 2 tables, formed of rough planks of wood, on which were placed large flat basins of tinned copper. Several sheep, roasted whole, were speedily dispatched. The Montenegrins eat but little bread, while they consume vast quantities of roast meat. During the repast songs were sung, and prayers offered up, in which every one joined. Proverbs and toasts were repeated, and the company laughed, sang, and joked, without neglecting, for a moment, to show every mark of politeness to their visitors. The festival, or sacra, is a solemn day, which in every house is devoted to the assemblage of all the members of the family. On this occasion every article of value is displayed, and the festival, on the whole, costs considerable expense. It is held in such high esteem by the Montenegrins that to omit it would be regarded as a sure sign of embarrassed circumstances, and the family would lose its credit. Those who are in danger of not possessing sufficient money to defray the expenses usually dispose of any articles of value that they can spare to enable them to provide the feast in a suitable way. It is customary to invite allied families, and even infants at the breast are admitted. Consequently, these meetings are numerously attended. One or more priests are always present. The repast consists of 3 or 4 courses. Before the guests sit down to table, the priest delivers a long prayer, which he recites slowly and with the most ludicrous contortions. The priest, or master of the house, and the person who, next to him, is held in the highest estimation, serve out the dishes standing opposite to each other. A large round loaf of bread is brought to the priest, who cuts it in the form of a cross down as far as the lower crust, but without separating it. He pours copious libations of wine into the incision, and then divides the loaf into 2 equal parts, one of which he keeps, and hands the other to his coadjutor. The latter distributes it in small pieces among the guests, by whom it is treasured up as something of great value. The priest then offers the other half of the loaf to the mistress of the house, who bows and thanks him, but, at the same time, declines to accept it in order that it may be offered to the most distinguished guest. The priest, and the person to whom it is presented, take hold of the piece of bread, which is to be separated in 2, and, in breaking it, each endeavors to appropriate to himself the largest portion of the lower crust. He who gains this advantage is saluted with the plaudits of the whole company, and has the honor of presenting the bread and a bottle of wine to the mistress of the house. During this ceremony the mistress burns incense through the apartment, and she afterwards receives the bread and wine with an air of triumphant satisfaction. On the table is placed a vessel containing wheat boiled in water and honey. A taper fixed up in the middle of the wheat burns from the beginning to the end of the feast. The mistress takes the vase and offers a spoonful of the wheat to each guest, and the remainder is thrown about the apartment as a token of abundance. Previous to the 3rd course, there is an offering of wine, which is distributed by the mistress. It is preceded by a short prayer, hymn, and benedictions. Only 1 glass is allowed to each person, but every one endeavors, amidst the confusion, to snatch another glass without being perceived. Thus the mistress is obliged to be constantly on her guard, and it is reckoned an extraordinary instance of address if she succeed in preventing the guests from taking anything beyond their specified allowance. Immediately after this ceremony the ecclesiastics withdraw, lest their presence should operate as a restraint on the gaiety of the company. The conversation then becomes noisy, and the laughter of the guests is mingled with the sound of the monochord and pipe. The Montenegrins burn neither oil nor tallow. Their tapers are made of narrow slips of fir, tree wood. At Skyclick I met with a man who had lived to see the 6th generation of his family. The old man himself was 117 years of age, his son was 100, his grandson nearly 82, and his great-grandson had attained his 60th year. The son of the latter was 43, his son 21, and his grandchild 2 years of age. The old man, in his 117th year, was lively and active. He remained at table until the last prayer was repeated, and he then asked leave to retire. Immediately all the guests rose, and in respectful silence advanced by turns to kiss the breast of the old man and receive his blessing. Similar instances of longevity are by no means rare in Montenegro, where habitual temperance, the salubrity of the water and food, and the excellence of the climate have, of course, a beneficial effect on the human constitution. The remainder of the evening was spent in various national games, during which the utmost decorum and harmony were observed. It was 10 o'clock when I retired to rest. A little chamber was allotted to the chasseur and myself in a pavilion detached from the rest of the house, and they carefully fastened the door, though a guard was stationed on the outside. We had no sooner fallen into our first sleep than we were roused by a loud firing and repeated cries, joined to the barking of all the dogs in the neighborhood. We immediately rose and began to look about us for weapons of defense. My companion found the barrel of a gun, and I happened to light on a small pitchfork. Thus armed, we stationed ourselves against the entrance of the apartment, determined to defend ourselves with all our might. At length the door opened, and what was our astonishment to behold the man of a century old with whom we had supped, and who thus addressed us in the Illyrian language. Do not disturb yourselves. Gentlemen, one of my sheep-folds has been threatened by robbers, and the guard has given the signal of alarm, to which we are answering, to inform them that we are on our defense. My father begs you will not disturb yourselves, and he sends you a dobra 6 nos, good night. We departed from Skyclick at day break. The weather was delightful. It is difficult to form an idea of the magical effect produced by Montenegro when the first rays of the morning sun gild the innumerable hills covered with trees, presenting 1,000 various tints of green. The village of Bielis is about 3 miles distant from Skyclick. It stands on a height which is observable from a great distance. On this eminence nets are spread to catch the ravens, which settle there twice every year for about 15 or 20 days. At these periods the inhabitants of Bielis consume no other food than the flesh of the ravens, which, in their opinion, contributes to longevity. It is true that the natives of this part of Montenegro live to a very advanced age, but it must be considered that they inhabit a hilly and an open country and are removed from everything that can have an injurious tendency on the health. On arriving at this village, we found only women and some feeble old men, who informed us that their cattle had been carried off by a large party of robbers, and that the young men were gone in pursuit of them. Our escort immediately set out in the direction which the robbers had taken, and, early next morning, returned accompanied by the villagers, bringing back their cattle towards with the heads of 2 of the robbers. On the following day we departed for Tomic, where we arrived at 11 o'clock in the forenoon, and partook of some refreshment. Tomic is a miserable hamlet, and is remarkable for nothing except the stupid pride of its inhabitants and the ruinous state of the houses. On leaving the village, we observed some boys engaged in a game which I will endeavor to describe. At about 6 feet from the wall of a church, or any other building, 2 wooden rods are fixed perpendicularly and in a parallel line at the distance of about 1 foot from each other. They are crossed at the top by a piece of wood, through which a hole is made by a gimlet, in order to admit a small cord. This cord hangs down as far as the waist of the player, and a ball, about the size of those used at billiards, is fastened to the end of it. A circle, about 6 inches in diameter, is traced out on the wall. The player takes the ball in his hand and aims at hitting the circle without altering the tension of the cord. To reckon a point, the ball must not merely enter the circle, but in rebounding must pass between the 2 rods without touching them. The player who first gains 12 points is declared the victor. We arrived early at Chivo. This village differs but little from Negasi. The country is even more open, and the soil, although flint in most parts, is nevertheless cultivated and fertile. The people of this village have a very wild appearance. They differ widely from those of the inhabitants of Negasi, who maintain daily intercourse with Catero. At Sivo, children came to lay hold of the buttons of my coat, which appeared strongly to attract their attention. Having perceived one of them endeavoring to cut off one with a knife, I offered him a piece of money, which he refused with disdain. I then gave him a button, and he appeared highly gratified. A second presented himself to obtain one, which I gave him. The chief of the Ease Court then dispersed the crowd, and I escaped with the loss of only 2 buttons. After considerable delay, an abode was offered to us, and we entered the first house we came to. We were presented with wine as a token of friendship. We were lodged at the house of an old soldier, who held the rank of brigadier at the age of 94. This man had traveled through many parts of Muscovy, and was perfectly well acquainted with Sweden, Venice, and the principal towns of Italy, as well as the south of France. He still remembered a little French, and spoke Italian very well. He was a man of considerable information, having seen much of the world, and being naturally of an active and intelligent turn of mind. Chapter 7. Remains of Roman Roads. Dangerous rencounter with a party of Turks. Example of courage in a woman. Montenegrin son, Dials. During my stay at Sivo, I received the strongest marks of kindness from my host. He supplied us abundantly with everything, but especially with food, which, among the Montenegrins, is a token of the greatest esteem. It being reported that the Turks had shewn themselves on the heights of Lastovic, our escort was doubled, and we departed at break of day. On the road from Sivo to Retici, through the woods, are the remains of a Roman road, which ran in the direction from Risano to Constantinople, through Montenegro. This is the Via Pentagiriana of which Lucius Junius speaks. It extends by many ramifications through the whole of Illyricum, where vestiges of it still remain, principally in Bosnia, from the road between Jani Sarajevo to Pristina, and from Castel Nuovo, where still exists a Roman bridge, to the right of Spanish fort. From thence it runs along by ancient Neronia towards the point of Vido in the direction of the old convent, and leads into Istria and Italy. We took every precaution during our march to secure ourselves against any sudden attack, and always kept a strong party both in advance and in our rear. About 11 o'clock, we perceived several Turks on an eminence which commanded the passage. The Montenegrins instantly examined their arms. The chief gave orders for a prompt movement, which I did not comprehend, and said to me, "If they wait for us, you shall soon see their heads at your feet." They then darted forward, without giving me time to follow them, and, in the twinkling of an eye, they reached the foot of the mountain occupied by the Turks. A brisk firing took place on both sides, but the Turks, judging from our numbers that they would have the worst of the contest, retired precipitately, and in the greatest disorder, leaving one of their party dead and 2 wounded. The latter were immediately seized and decapitated, and their heads were brought in triumph to me. This spectacle caused me many painful sensations, and made me more than once regret having undertaken this journey. I knew, indeed, that it was conformable to the military laws of these people to cut off the heads of their enemies who have the misfortune to fall into their hands. They fix them on poles on the tops of mountains and in the most frequented roads on the frontiers. They would not show any favor even to a sovereign in such circumstances. Many of our brave countrymen, and, among others, General Delgorgues, have fallen victims to this barbarous practice. At the siege of Castel Nuovo, instances of singular atrocity occurred. Some Montenegrins, in a fit of intoxication, amused themselves by playing at 9 pins with the heads of some Frenchmen, and, at the same time, directing insulting language towards them. See, said they every moment, how roundly these Frenchmen's heads roll, a cruel irony on the imputed levity of the French nation. We quickened our march in order to arrive early at Cerretti, that we might supply ourselves with provisions. At Cerretti I resolved to visit a chapel in the neighborhood of the mountains. Our journey thither was agreeable, though somewhat fatiguing. We stopped for some hours at a village, where we found the peasants disgustingly vulgar and ignorant on every subject. We saw nothing worthy of notice here except an ex homo in the church, painted by an artist named Martini. It is by no means a contemptible production, and certainly the best painting I saw in the whole country. The account which is given of its discovery partakes of the errors of the earliest periods of superstition. The picture, they say, fell from heaven at the foot of a shepherd, who carried it to the curate of the village. We soon passed through a wild country, which as far as by Chissy is almost inaccessible. During the whole journey there is not a spot of verdure to relieve the eye, no trace of a living being, not even of a bird to interrupt the dismal solitude. About 11 years ago this desert was the scene of a singular act of presence of mind and determined courage. 4 Montenegrins, accompanied by their sister, aged 21, went on a pilgrimage to St. Basil. They were surprised by 7 Turks on one of the defiles of the mountains, which was so extremely narrow that only one person could pass at a time. The Turks fired suddenly upon them, by which one of the Montenegrins was killed and another wounded. The female seized the musket of her dead brother and continued to fire upon the Turks till her other brothers were also disabled. The Montenegrins, however, had defended themselves so well that only 1 Turk remained alive out of the 7. On seeing this man approach her, the unfortunate girl stood still for a moment, but suddenly affecting an air of terror and supplication, she implored his mercy. She hesitated, but at last pretended that she would accede to his wishes, when she suddenly plunged into his bowels the dagger which she wore in her girdle, and left the instrument of her vengeance in the body of the Mussulman. Though mortally wounded, the Turk was still bent on revenge, and drawing the dagger from his body, he tottered towards the wretched woman, who in despair threw herself on her enemy, and by a sudden effort precipitated him into the neighboring abyss, at the moment when some shepherds, attracted by the long-continued firing, had come to her aid. The recital of this interesting story occupied our attention until we arrived at Cerretti. We were presented on our entrance with wine and some fried potatoes in a wooden bowl. We were lodged in the house of the primate Zerlich, who immediately gave orders for killing some lambs and kids and making some bread and cakes for our entertainment. From all I have seen I am convinced that the Montenegrins live well, though temperately. They take their meals at the hours customary with Europeans. All the family eat at one time, but the men and the women are separated. They all sit on the ground in the Turkish manner, or on very low stools. They have no table, cloth, and usually make use of a small branch of a tree, divided at each end instead of a fork. Their food consists chiefly of herbs, seasoned only with a little salt, or of milk, eggs, and salt. Fish, they likewise consume a great quantity of onions and garlic, which render their breath very disagreeable. The common drink is water, but when the men make a journey of any length they carry wine with them. Every time that I took out my watch to learn the hour it was regarded by the natives with a sort of stupid wonder, and I was asked 1,000 questions concerning it. I found that it was only within these 8 years that watches had been used in that part of Montenegro bordering upon Dalmatia. In the other parts they are totally unknown. The people of Zant, especially, have no idea of them. A Montenegrin soldier, on hearing the motion of a watch he had taken at the siege of Ragusa, was seized with terror, and believing that it contained an evil spirit, threw it on the ground and broke it to pieces with stones. When I asked how they ascertained the time of the day without clocks or watches, I was told that they did so by means of sun dials, which were made by a man named Zuanovich. The next morning I visited Zuanovich, who showed me one of his sun dials. It was a stone lying horizontally, with a polished surface on which were traced 3 marks denoting sun, rise, noon, and sun, set. But, said I, the intervals leave you in uncertainty. We judge of them by comparison, replied he. I inquired by what rule he was guided in making his calculations. He said, I mark the place for the style and introduce it without fixing it, which I only do definitively after repeated observations.